Good morning, and welcome to this third session of the Carolina Public Humanities Seminar on the Global Challenge of Religious Freedom. I'm Lloyd Kramer. I'm a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill and also the director of Carolina Public Humanities. And I want to follow up on Max Orr's comments at the first session of this seminar yesterday by thanking again our many supporters who helped to make these discussions possible. I particularly thank Carolina Meadows and the Merca Group at Morgan Stanley, and also the many individual donors who have continued to provide much needed contributions to CPH during this time of the pandemic. We deeply appreciate the great friends who have helped us reshape the work of Carolina Public Humanities during this extraordinary year of transitions and changes. So I want to remind you that we began our seminar yesterday with some very insightful discussions of religious freedom, secularism, and religious oppression in modern France and in modern China. Our speakers, Max Orr and Ariane Echeni, gave us outstanding, well-informed summaries of how people in France tried to separate religion from state power, and how China claimed to protect religious freedom even as it suppressed the Muslim Uyghurs in Western China. So as Max and Ariane both explained, the apparent defense of human rights and secular values can also lead to repressive actions against groups deemed to be dangerous or regressive, including Jews or Muslims in France and large Muslim communities in China. Religious groups can often become objects of scorn or social prejudice, and this pattern seems to be reappearing now, particularly with the scapegoating of Muslims in places such as France and China that we talked about. But many other groups are affected too. So today we're going to continue the discussion of religious freedom and religious repression, and we'll come back to some of the themes that emerged in yesterday's sessions. But our first session today turns to changes in the cultural context by focusing on the history of the United States and American ideas about religious freedom and religious repression. Our third speaker in this seminar is Joanna Sirks-Smith, who is our Associate Director for State Outreach and Strategic Partnerships at Carolina Public Humanities. You'll find information about Joanna on the biographical summary you received in advance of this seminar, but I want to note a few aspects of the intellectual trajectory that has brought her to this seminar on religious freedom in the modern world. She grew up in New England and completed her undergraduate work at Connecticut College, and then after some other work in the Northeast, she later entered the graduate program in religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill, where she received her MA degree and where she is now finishing her dissertation. She will therefore receive her PhD later this year, and we're going to have a big party about that. But even before the pandemic comes to an end, she is working full speed ahead. During her graduate career, she has become a strong advocate for the public humanities. She was chosen to be one of our Maynard Adams Fellows for the Public Humanities in 2018, and her experience in this program gave her a good foundation for her current outreach work. Joanna's work at CPH focuses especially on the development of new partnerships with community colleges, and she's off to a great start by creating a number of imaginative new collaborations. We're extremely pleased that she was able to join CPH just before the pandemic led to an almost complete lockdown on new appointments. But as I noted, the pandemic has not slowed Joanna down, and as she finishes her dissertation on the social and religious dimensions of meat production and hog slaughter in North Carolina, Joanna is also building new partnerships with community college colleagues across the state. She's eager to discuss the humanities and humanistic debates with diverse communities across the state of North Carolina and outside the university. And her ideas about religious freedom in America suggest the wide range of her interests and historical perspectives. Joanna's talk today is entitled One Nation Under God, Freedom of, For, and From Religion in America. She'll discuss how ideas about religious freedom have evolved in the United States, and she'll help us see how and why religion has been significant for American national identity. And we'll have questions and answers after her talk, and you can submit questions through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. So I'm very happy now to welcome Joanna Sirks-Smith to this seminar on the global challenge to religious freedom. Joanna, welcome to the stage.
Well, thank you so much for that kind welcome, Lloyd. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, even virtually, and I'm looking forward especially to engaging more with Max and Ariane in our panel discussion later today, because so much of what they discussed yesterday, as Lloyd mentioned, really resonates with the American context as well. So I want to start out today by reflecting for a moment on why religious freedom is such a hot button issue in America today. Nobody seems to disagree that we should have religious freedom, but there is intense disagreement about what that should look like on the ground. Here we have an image from the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, where some of those who gathered were very angry about the idea that their religious freedoms were being trampled. But what do they mean by religious freedom? They likely mean something very different than what the sign holders at this protest from 2015 mean. Today we can see from just the sheer number of organizations committed to the idea of religious freedom and meaning totally different things by it, what a fraught notion this is. We have, for example, a group called the Alliance Defending Freedom that claims in its mission statement, quote, as secular forces chip away at our nation's Judeo-Christian roots, religious freedom is increasingly threatened. And then on the other hand, you have the Freedom from Religion Foundation, whose stated mission is to, quote, promote non-theism and defend the constitutional separation between religion and government. Championing religious freedom, but they mean very different things. And there are a few dynamics that I'll point to off the bat here that make religious freedom a particularly contested issue in the US. We have a huge and growing religious diversity. And that includes, it's important to note, both people of committed faith and also what we in religious studies call the nones, which is to say atheists and agnostics. There's also a very embattled Christian legacy in the US. For most of American history, Protestants have been the clear and dominant majority. And over the last 50 years, as this dominance has been challenged, religious freedom has been pulled into the center of our national stage and has become a divisive and partisan issue. So we're going to cover a lot of ground together today, but I'm not going to be able to give a blow-by-blow of every little step in the transitions between different forms of religious freedom in the United States. We could spend an entire semester unpacking all of that together. Instead, my main goals with you here this morning are first to think through some of the iterations of religious freedom in American history. In particular, what experiments fueled the First Amendment protection of religious freedom, and how did that First Amendment shape the American religious landscape? Then I want to highlight some key shifts in recent decades that have truly transformed what religious freedom means under American law. And in closing, I want to consider together some of the persistent challenges of enacting ideals of religious freedom in America, and many of these I think will resonate in a global context as well. So to start out, let's rewind all the way back to the colonial period. Because of course, American ideas about religious freedom did not just begin with the Constitution. In the colonies, there were already a number of different experiments running. And as you'll see, these were generally more experiments in religious tolerance than in what we would see as religious freedom today. So let's start with the southern colonies. In colonial Virginia, the Carolinas, and Maryland, Anglicanism was the official state religion. And in places like Virginia, this started off quite draconian. Church attendance was mandatory, and there was even a threat of execution if you missed church 3 times. Now, this was not enforced. It turned out to actually be very difficult to enforce a state religion in a region where folks were so geographically spread out. So very quickly, the policies around the state church softened, and other sects of Protestantism were allowed to worship fairly freely. Here on the right of this slide, we have an image of a circuit rider, which is a preacher who would ride between towns to preach to rural communities who were each too small to have their own church. Still, until the time of the Revolution, taxpayer dollars in these colonies were going to fund Anglican churches and Anglican. For those of you who already have the text of the First Amendment in mind, this probably feels really dissonant with the ban on any law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, among these colonies, Maryland stands out for the explicit safeguards that it had in place for religious minorities. For the most part, legal protections across the colonies only extended to Protestants. But Maryland also had protections in place for Catholics, which was a radical inclusion of the time. Another challenge for Southern colonies was how to deal with the dilemma of religious tolerance for enslaved people. There was an enormous tension between, on the one hand, the logic that the mission of slavery was to Christianize, and at the same time, a very real concern that full and unsupervised access to religious texts and religious spaces would give enslaved people the tools to argue for their own abolition, as well as the space to politically organize. So many enslaved people wound up seizing their own religious freedom by worshiping in secret, outside of the watchful gaze of whites. And here we have an image of a praise house where this kind of surreptitious worship could take place. Paul, are we having an issue with the slides here? Absolutely, yeah, and we can talk through the images when they get back up and running. So moving north to New York and Pennsylvania, instead of the state churches of the South, we see very deliberate experiments in pluralism. When New Amsterdam, which would later become Manhattan, was first founded, it was a radically tolerant colony. You had Dutch Calvinists, French Huguenots, Jews, and Quakers all living side by side. And in a moment here, I'll show you an image of the first Jewish congregation in the colonies, which was founded in New York in 1654. And this policy of religious tolerance gained traction for a very simple and pragmatic reason. New Amsterdam was becoming an economic powerhouse simply because of its religious diversity. Unlike so many other port cities around the world who were hostile to religious minorities, New York could have traders coming from all over Europe and peacefully coexisting and peacefully making deals with one another. Now, Pennsylvania embraced pluralism for a much more moralistic reason. It was founded by William Penn, who was himself a Quaker, who had been imprisoned in England several times because of his faith. And when Penn founded Pennsylvania, he wanted to ensure that this did not happen to anyone else. So he built in protections for Christians of diverse denominations, including Quakers, who were considered one of the most socially dangerous groups of their day. And so here it looks like we've got the slides up and running again. You can see an image on the right of a Quaker meeting where a woman is preaching. So you can guess at some of the reasons this was considered such a radical movement. Pennsylvania was also the first colony to make any concerted efforts to safeguard Native American religious freedoms. And now we get up to New England, where we find a different experiment altogether. The New England colonies, with the exception of Rhode Island, were set up as pure theocracies. Here we have an image of the Salem witch trials, as well as a hyper-religious primer that was used in schools in New England. The Puritans did not, as many of us were taught in school, come to the New World to establish a society based on religious freedom. They wanted freedom for their own Calvinist church, but they saw any dissent as a threat to that. Church and civil government were absolutely fused. As in the South, churches were funded by the state. But unlike in the South, this state church was brutally enforced, with civil magistrates punishing religious deviants and even going so far as to exile, torture, and execute religious dissenters like the Quakers who I just mentioned. And in fact, it took an intervention from England in the form of the Act of Toleration of 1689 to bring these persecutions to a stop. And I want to highlight this word toleration. This was not an act of religious freedom. It was an act of toleration. So what you can hear there is that there was still understood to be a state-approved, i.e. correct, religion, but that religion would have to consent to put up with everyone else. So it's still a huge step away from the more egalitarian vision of pluralism that our founders aimed to set in place. Our founders had all of these experiments in how a state could handle religious diversity at their fingertips as they considered how to include religious freedom in the Constitution. There was the South with its state churches, experiments in tolerance in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York, and New England with its theocratic governance. And these different experiments helped to fuel the conversation taking place at the time of the Revolution around why we should even want freedom of religion. And there are certainly a few super pragmatic reasons that were in the air in the late 1700s. Maybe we want freedom of religion to protect the economy. Look at the example of New York that we just discussed. Creating the space for religious diversity had allowed New York to have as many trading partners as possible. Or maybe we want religious freedom simply to stave off violence. Religious wars had been wreaking havoc on Europe since the Reformation. Our founders thought unless we safeguard against this, our democracy could quickly devolve into warring religious states. But then we get to a few slightly more complicated ideas about why we should pursue this ideal. One line of thinking was that we need to protect the government from church interference. Our founders worried that if a religious group seized control of the young republic, representative democracy could easily crumble. So this seems like an argument in favor of freedom from religion. Others thought the precise inverse was the case. Churches were the ones that were vulnerable to being corrupted by government influence. And this certainly resonates with the ideas of early colonists like the Puritans or like William Penn, who believed that they were safeguarding a pure remnant of Christianity, this pure remnant that could easily be corrupted if government officials could get their fingers in church doctrine. This is what I like to call freedom for religion, by which I mean freedom for religious groups to act without government intervention. And it's out of the tension of these two ideas that I just outlined, by the way, that we get the idea of a wall of separation between church and state, a wall that can protect each one of those from the influence of the other. But there's one final rationale that I want to bring up and highlight that's subtly different from wanting freedom for churches. And this is the argument that freedom of individual conscience is simply a natural right. It's a right that every American should have totally outside of organized religion. The freedom to be religious or not, to follow a doctrine or not. This idea reflects the Enlightenment leanings of our founders, many of whom believed that reason gave humankind all the tools that we need to develop and discover spiritual truths, which makes it unnecessary for morality and faith to be imposed from above, either by a government or by a church. And this last rationale, that we should want freedom of religion because it's a natural individual right, I think really helps to explain the push away from mere tolerance and towards freedom. So I'd like to hone in on a short excerpt from a letter by George Washington that really captures this distinction. After he assumed the presidency, Washington received a huge number of letters from minority religious groups, basically asking him to affirm that the federal government was actually going to step up and defend religious liberty. And this is what he wrote in response to a letter from a Rhode Island synagogue. Quote, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights." So he's saying the logic behind tolerance is that it's an act of generosity on the part of the majority. No, he says, freedom of religion is a right, not a privilege that the majority can give or take away. So freedom of religion is enshrined in the Constitution through our First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it looks really simple to sum up religious freedom in one sentence like this. But it turns out to be really difficult to work into the nitty-gritty of public life. Does this apply to every religion? Does it apply to the states or just to the federal government? Does it mean, as it seems to imply, that potentially any action could be protected if it's done for a religious reason? Well, as things played out in early America, the First Amendment did not wind up really standing in the way of laws that favored the Protestant majority. A number of states went ahead and wrote state churches into their constitutions, supported by tax dollars. And in places, these state churches lasted into the 1840s. The move towards disestablishment, the removal of these state churches, came very gradually on a state-by-state basis, really only as citizens grew more concerned about taxation and as America grew more diverse. Another surprising piece of evidence of this pervasive Protestant dominance is religious oaths of office. Although the Constitution bans religious tests for public office at a federal level, many state constitutions still included them. So here's North Carolina's, which, for example, states, quote, that no person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion or the divine authority either of the Old or New Testaments, or who shall hold religious principles incompatible with the freedom and safety of the state, shall be capable of holding office or place of trust or profit in the civil department within this state. That feels very much at odds with the ideals presented in the First Amendment. And yet, to folks at this time, this would have felt fairly inclusive compared to colonial law. It includes many kinds of Protestants. But it's telling that it took so long for these religious tests to get flagged as problematic. Although some states cast them aside in practice in the late 1800s, these state-level religious tests did not get formally struck down by the Supreme Court as a violation of the First Amendment until 1961. It's a reminder of what a stronghold Protestant traditions had in the early U.S. At the time of the Revolution, about 98% of Americans of European descent were Protestant. And well into the 20th century, even those Americans who opposed things like state churches and religious tests for office still assumed that a general Protestant attitude and sensibility would underpin public institutions like schools and like the legislature. And they weren't wrong. Here, for example, we have an image of children reciting the Lord's Prayer in school, which was common practice in some states up into the early 1960s. Now, I've highlighted a few legal signs of Protestant dominance, but I also want to highlight a cultural phenomenon that helped to keep this dynamic in place. As scholar Tissa Wenger argues, one way that this Protestant dominance was justified was through a narrative that Protestantism was uniquely well-suited for democracy. And the reverse was thought to be true as well. One of the most common tropes used throughout American history to pay lip service to religious freedom while actually undermining it is the assertion that some religions are simply by nature anti-democratic. And if we believe them to be anti-democratic and to therefore pose a threat to the very underpinnings of religious freedom, well, then we have to exclude them from our circle of pluralism. And this charge has been leveled against a number of groups throughout our history, posing a huge obstacle to religious minorities being fully accepted into American public life. For a long time, this charge was loudly leveled against Catholics, with suspicions being raised that their primary loyalty would always be to the Vatican, not to the U.S. And as immigrants from Catholic countries like Ireland and Italy poured into the country in the 1800s and early 1900s, this anti-Catholic sentiment often erupted into violence, such as the riots that took place in Philadelphia in 1844. And here in the upper left-hand corner, you can see an image of a convent being burned to the ground by a mob. This is widely considered to have hit a breaking point with the election of JFK as our first Catholic president. But before that, it was extremely potent as a tool for undermining the very right of Catholic Americans to be here. This charge has also often been leveled against Jews. Pieces of anti-Semitic propaganda like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion spread the allegation that an underground network of Jews was secretly plotting world takeover. This myth has transformed over time, but it has not disappeared, and it has led to outbursts of anti-Semitic violence involving everything from attacks on synagogues to the lynching of Jews. And here in the lower left-hand corner, we have a plaque marking the site where Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager in Atlanta, was lynched. This charge has also been brought against many fringe religions, what we would now call new religious movements, or what you might hear about in the press as cults. Perhaps the most telling example of this is Mormons, who were so reviled around the time of their founding that they were literally run out of the United States territories by a lynch mob. In the bottom right-hand corner here, you'll see an image of the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, being tarred and feathered by an angry mob. And lastly, this idea that some religions are incompatible with democracy likely sounds most familiar to you because of how it's been used in recent years to support Islamophobia. Here it's mostly caricatures of Sharia law that have been used to paint Muslims as somehow not only less than fully American, but less than capable of becoming American. And you can see in this slide an image of a protester holding a sign that says, "Never Sharia law in America." And it's this caricature, in part, that President Trump was able to harness in gaining popular support for his Muslim ban. Remember, many of the folks who supported that ban would also profess to be enormous supporters of religious freedom. But by claiming that Islam is incompatible with democracy, they could square that circle and justify Trump's attempt to keep Muslims out of the country. So this idea represents a dangerous thread that runs through American history of a Protestant majority wanting to have it both ways, both wanting to embrace religious freedom, in name at least, and yet also wanting religious and cultural hegemony. Paul, are we having another slide issue here? All right, I'll keep rolling as we're working on the slides. Because there's one final place that I want to highlight where we still encounter this kind of Protestant dominance in a very palpable way, and that's in American civil religion. Civil religion refers to the set of rituals and symbols that surround the state. So think about displays of patriotism on Memorial Day or the 4th of July, or even at the start of a sports game. Or think about the kind of pomp and circumstance that surrounds the presidential inauguration. This is civil religion. And in the United States, civil religion is absolutely saturated with Christianity. We've actually already seen an image of this in action today, of a hand on a Bible being sworn in. And in a moment here, I'll be able to show you a few more examples of this in action. We have crosses used in military cemeteries as a symbol of the neutral, general American soldier. We have religious patriotic songs like God Bless America that are sung at state events. We have mentions of God in the Pledge of Allegiance and on our currency. And even though this fusion of Christianity and patriotism had been there all along in American history, latent, it was spelled out in a much more explicit way starting in the 1950s. It was only then that a mention of God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and "In God We Trust" was added to American currency. And this seems to have been driven by a Cold War desire to loudly differentiate American godliness from atheistic communism. Now, somewhat unsurprisingly, many, though not all, of the cases that came to the Supreme Court in the early and mid-20th century regarding religious freedom were brought by minority groups or by non-religious groups contesting Protestant norms that had been structured into American law. And the courts began to grapple with messy questions about lived religion. Should people be able to take days off from work in order to worship? Maintain unfettered access to sacred sites. This was a huge one for Native American religious groups. Marry whomever their religion allows. Educate their children in religious schools or at home, or perhaps only until the 8th grade. Deny their children medical care if they believe that faith healing is the only godly way to heal a body. Sacrifice animals. The list goes on. All of these examples are real cases that have been brought up to some of the highest courts in the country. And they've been brought up by minority religious groups, by Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, the Amish, Seventh-day Adventists, practitioners of Santeria, Native American religious groups. And in just about all of these cases, the state found itself weighing religious freedom on the one hand against a general law on the other, a general good or a general state imperative. And sometimes they ruled in favor of the religious group and sometimes in favor of the general law. And that's because religious rights are not negotiated in a vacuum. Thank you, Paul. They're often in tension with other rights that the state is invested in defending. And here we have an image of some Amish plaintiffs approaching the court. Now, this brings us to one of the biggest challenges to Protestant dominance. This challenge came not in the form of religious minorities gaining rights, but rather in the form of anti-discrimination law. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and more importantly, with the choice of the courts to stand up and defend it, equality was upheld as a more important principle than religious freedom. There's a really important facet of the history of race in this country that we have somewhat forgotten, that racism was a religious conviction for many segregationists. Biblical arguments were made for the separation of the races. Segregation was preached from pulpits as being part of God's design. And this religious motive for racism was put to a judicial test in a Supreme Court case in 1983. This case focused on Bob Jones University, an evangelical school in South Carolina. And although Bob Jones consented to allow black students into the school after 1971, they still insisted that interracial dating and marriage were wrong. And therefore, they would only admit black applicants who were already married, who they therefore didn't have to worry about dating the white students. So in 1976, observing this policy, the IRS revoked Bob Jones's tax-exempt status. And the court battle over this tax-exempt status went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Bob Jones University argued that because its belief in the segregation of the races was part of a sincerely held set of religious beliefs, it ought to be protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court disagreed, saying this is a case where compelling state interest in ending segregation in education outweighed the First Amendment rights at stake. In defending the Civil Rights Act, they chose equality over the religious freedom to discriminate. And I want you to have this example at the back of your minds today as we move forward to look at some of the conversations taking place today around religious freedom and discrimination against LGBTQ communities. And bear in mind as well, it's not that the courts stopped caring about religious rights, it's just that they were starting to care about other rights a little bit more. Now, it's not a coincidence that the timing of this Supreme Court case and the threat that it posed to the autonomy of religious organizations lined up with the formation of a coalition on the religious right. This coalition, which was originally spearheaded in part by conservative Christian groups like Focus on the Family and the Moral Majority, took up the cry that religious freedom in America was under attack. Focus on the Family, which was founded in 1977, used radio shows and literature and Bible study programs to spread the message that America was at risk of moral decay and losing its Christian identity. And they've had many political agendas over the years, like abstinence-only education in public schools, but these days they're extremely focused on combating what they call the pro-gay agenda of the government and the public school system. The Moral Majority had its roots in rallies held in the 1970s by Jerry Falwell Sr., who's pictured here at a rally. He is a televangelist and founder of Liberty University. And the goal of the Moral Majority was to mobilize conservative Christian voters across denominational lines, mostly by whipping up moral panic about the state of America's growing secularism. The Moral Majority itself dissolved in the late 1980s as Reagan's presidency made its leaders feel like their goals had been met, but its political legacy has been very long-lasting. So turning back for a moment to the Civil Rights Act, here we have an example where the First Amendment right to freedom of religion did not give segregationists a pass on following a generally applicable law. And this ruling was in keeping with the judicial norm by the 1980s. The Supreme Court at this time was really interpreting the First Amendment as only forbidding the government to pass regulations that explicitly targeted a particular religious group. And this logic was formalized in a critical case in 1990. And I hope you'll all bear with me now as we dive into some nitty-gritty judicial and legislative history that I think is absolutely essential to understanding how we got where we are today. So in this 1990 case, which originated in Oregon, two members of the Native American Church, one of whom, Al Smith, is pictured here, had been fired from their jobs at a state drug rehab clinic. And they were fired because they tested positive for peyote. They argued peyote use is a central religious ritual for us, and it's therefore unconstitutional for us to be fired for it. The state, who was also their employer, argued that the law allowing them to fire employees for drug use was a pretty reasonable general law, and it was not intended to target members of the Native American Church, so it should not be struck down as discriminatory. And the Supreme Court, in this case, held up Oregon's decision. Basically, the justices concluded it's not the job of the government to bend over backward to make sure that no law burdens religious practice. The government should just be stopped from making laws that are clearly aimed at repressing a particular religious group. And here we have a quote from Justice Scalia writing for the majority, who wrote, "To permit this would make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and in effect permit every citizen to become a law unto himself." Now, this is critical. What happened after this in terms of peyote use? Across the nation, members of the Native American Church petitioned state governments for very specific exceptions to be written into regulations around drug use that would allow them to continue using peyote as a part of religious rituals. And across the nation, states said sure and wrote these amendments into their regulations. So this was a very targeted way of addressing an issue of religious freedom. It was specific, it addressed just one problem, and it was done by state legislatures rather than by a sweeping court decision. But to religious leaders and to the public, this Supreme Court decision seemed to mark a dangerous precedent. Because in this case, the First Amendment had not successfully protected the rights of the religious plaintiffs. Clearly, the courts could not be trusted to apply the First Amendment vigorously enough. And this meant that a new piece of legislation would have to be created to almost turbocharge the First Amendment and protect religious freedom. So in 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or the RFRA, as it came to be called, was passed. And this was introduced by Chuck Schumer. A companion bill was introduced by Ted Kennedy, and it was signed by Bill Clinton. And this may strike many of you as surprising. It struck me as surprising as well, since religious freedom has come to be associated so strongly with the conservative movement and the Republican Party. But this was still a very bipartisan issue at the time. It was supported almost unanimously in Congress. And this act was an explicit response to the Supreme Court ruling in Employment Division versus Smith. This act pointed out that whether or not a law is designed to burden someone's religious freedom is really a moot point. What matters is whether a religious freedom is being burdened or not. And so it laid out a new standard that all laws would be held up against. And in layman's terms, this bill stated, all right, if a law is going to in any way burden religious freedom, then, number one, that law's goals need to be immensely important. And number two, that law has to be designed in the least burdensome, which is to say the most religiously tolerant way that it could possibly be designed while achieving its goal. And as we'll see, these two criteria are very broad, and they suddenly brought literally every law under potential scrutiny for incidentally burdening free religion. This new law guaranteed much more sweeping protections than the First Amendment, and it especially made it much easier for religious organizations and institutions to argue that their free exercise of religion was being burdened. Instead of having to prove that their First Amendment rights were being violated, religious actors could now simply point to the RFRA. So it had truly pushed the boundaries of what could be claimed as religious freedom. And as soon as a case came up before the Supreme Court that referenced the RFRA, this was in 1997, the justices declared, you know what, the RFRA itself is unconstitutional. And in the court ruling here, Justice Kennedy wrote, quote, "Congress does not enforce a constitutional right by changing what the right is." Judges struck it down from state and municipal level applications, leaving the RFRA in place only at a federal level. And as we'll discuss in a moment, that remnant left in place in the federal government remained very potent. It was that remnant of RFRA that enabled the Hobby Lobby case. However, as soon as the Supreme Court struck down the RFRA, people again began to panic about religious freedoms being taken away. So states began passing their own versions of bills that were modeled on the federal RFRA. Here we have a chart from 2015, and this shows states that have passed this kind of legislation, the states in light blue here. 21 states now have RFRAs of their own, nearly half the states in the nation. And these state RFRAs allow for sweeping religious exemptions to general laws. To some scholars, these feel like Pandora's box. They make it very difficult, potentially, for states to apply general laws when individuals or organizations cite religious reasons not to comply with them. The most sweeping of these RFRAs was championed by then Governor Mike Pence in Indiana in 2015, and this version was criticized for its transparent goal of allowing Christian hospitals, schools, and nonprofits to discriminate against members of the LGBTQ community. Indiana's RFRA, which drew on the Hobby Lobby ruling, which we'll get to in a moment, defined person in the bill as an individual, an organization, or a corporation, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, as all deserving of equal religious rights. So again, this radical expansion, not only of what religious freedom means, but of who it applies to. I ran across this cartoon, and it seems to sum up very aptly how some scholars see these RFRAs as affecting the overall relationship between church and state. Within the logic of this cartoon, it's actually religious freedom that is now allowing religious organizations and individuals to breach this wall and to opt out of a general rule of law. As I mentioned, the federal remnant of RFRA still stands, and it came into the spotlight in 2014 in a major way. So let's now turn to the Hobby Lobby case, which was ruled on in 2014. This case centered on the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate, which required employers to provide contraception to women as part of their basic health care. There were already broad religious exemptions written into this mandate. Churches and other, quote, frankly religious organizations were exempt, as were explicitly religious nonprofits like the University of Notre Dame. So this left only non-religious, for-profit corporations who were subject to the contraception mandate. Hobby Lobby was one of those, and it challenged that. It's important to know a little bit about Hobby Lobby if you don't already. It's a chain of craft stores around the country, and at the time of this case, it had over 600 locations, about 32,000 employees, and over $4 billion in annual revenue. But it is owned by one family, and they are evangelical. Hobby Lobby's owners believed that some forms of contraception are functionally abortions, and so they balked at giving those out to employees. Arguing it would violate their beliefs to make them give out this contraception, they petitioned the court for an exemption. Now, it goes without saying that this is not the kind of religious actor that even the original RFRA had in mind. These laws were initially designed to protect the little guy, to protect disenfranchised religious minorities, not multi-billion-dollar corporations. Unsurprisingly, a vitriolic fight surrounded this case, with activists on both sides arguing that the case marked a slippery slope. And here we have an image, on the one hand, of a protester dressed as the Bible and holding a sign that says, "Use me not for your bigotry," alongside protesters holding signs demanding religious liberty. On the side of Hobby Lobby, you had lawyers arguing that this case marked the start of a slide into government interference in religion. If the government could force this one family to distribute contraception, even though it was dissonant with their religious beliefs, then it was just a matter of time before the government could start forcing all Americans to act in ways incompatible with their faith. On the opposite side of the argument, you had lawyers saying the real slippery slope is that religious exemption laws designed to protect small minority groups can now be leveraged by massive corporations and by the clear religious majority to opt out of the general rule of law. As one scholar framed it, the fundamental question at stake in this case was whether Hobby Lobby was more like a house of worship or more like ExxonMobil. And the courts decided it's more like a house of worship. Hobby Lobby won this case, which meant that overnight, many corporations were changed into religious actors deserving of legal protection. And this Hobby Lobby ruling serves as a stark reminder that as we think about religious freedom in the United States, we are often these days talking about what I call freedom for religion, which is to say the freedom for religious organizations to opt out of general law rather than individuals. And we're talking well beyond places of worship. We're talking about hospitals, schools, adoption agencies, homeless shelters, even now for-profit businesses that happen to be owned by religious proprietors. Before we leave this topic, I do want to stress that in the Hobby Lobby case, as in the general controversies over state RFRAs, there were religious groups on both sides of this argument. This has been quite partisan along political lines, but there have been religious activists fighting hard both for and against these expansions of what religious freedom means. We're at a moment in American history where this is playing out in both the legislature and in the courts. And we are also just this month at a flashpoint in the history of freedom for religion with current disputes over the Equality Act. The Equality Act is an attempt to extend protections against religiously motivated discrimination to LGBTQ Americans, and it has many on the religious right up in arms about another discrimination law that could strip them of what they see as a constitutional right to stand by their religious belief in heterosexual marriage. As we look forward to seeing what happens with this act and in the years to come, I want to briefly reflect on a few persistent challenges in actually establishing religious freedom in the United States. We've touched on all of these today, but I think they bear repeating. First, protecting religious freedom often means prioritizing one right over another. We have case after case that illustrates this. The religious freedom of a business owner to refuse service is weighed against the rights of a queer couple to go about their daily lives without discrimination. The right of a nurse to not handle abortions that she finds religiously abhorrent is weighed against the rights of a woman who comes in needing urgent medical care. The religious freedom of congregants to gather during a pandemic is weighted against the rights of their neighbors, family, and coworkers to be protected from the virus. Here we have an image from a Hasidic neighborhood in Brooklyn where religious gatherings during COVID became the source of a recent Supreme Court case over this very issue. So just a reminder that religious freedom does not exist in isolation. It exists in tension with this web of general laws that govern American life and that aim to maintain safety, equality, and general order. Another huge challenge is that what counts as a religious issue is always in flux. A prime example of this that we discussed today is white supremacy, which was once considered a religious issue by mainstream America. Abortion is another example. In the years leading up to and then immediately following Roe v. Wade, American Protestant denominations were quite uninterested in the issue of abortion, considered it a Catholic issue. It was only in the late 1970s that the religious right picked this up as a politically and religiously charged issue. So it's very difficult to anticipate where there are going to be religious accommodations needed when literally any area of American life might be taken up as a religious issue by one group or another. And I want to stress this is not disingenuous on the part of religious groups. This is how religion works. Priorities shift and new issues arise that religious groups have to respond to. Here we have an image of a huge revival meeting. And I want to point out that this particular challenge is fairly manageable when an issue branded as religious is picked up by small religious groups. But when issues are picked up by large religious groups, they often become huge bones of political contention. Next, a perpetual challenge is that the state and religion are still financially entangled. When we talk about religious freedom, we're not just talking about the government allowing a religious organization to do something or not, we're really talking about the government funding it or not. There are broad tax exemptions for religious organizations, including a housing subsidy for faith leaders. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation in particular has pushed back against these exemptions in recent years, saying they clearly amount to state support of religion. Religious organizations are also eligible to receive federal and state funding through grant programs, including, for example, the PPP program that was introduced last year during the pandemic. And here's an image of a televangelist who recently got into hot water about purchasing a jet with some PPP funds. We saw this funding issue come up in the Bob Jones University case. The government did not say that Bob Jones University would have to shut down if it kept its racist policies. It just said that Bob Jones could not continue to take advantage of tax exemptions while discriminating. So the role that money plays in these debates is definitely worth keeping an eye on. Another challenge is that religious exemptions can wind up giving religious groups a privileged relationship to the law, a relationship that atheists and agnostics do not get to enjoy. Certain actions are protected in the US if they're motivated by religious belief that are not protected if they're motivated by non-religious belief. So for example, there are faith-based exemptions in place in a number of states for parents who refuse their children medical care on the grounds that it goes against their religious beliefs. We most often see this with Christian Scientists for whom faith healing is an absolutely core religious tenet. But you as an American cannot medically neglect your child just because you don't feel like taking them to the doctor, but you can refuse to take them to the doctor because of religious belief, and should the child suffer or die as a result of that, you have some pretty strong legal protections in place. That's a grim but very important example to bring up. We see the same kind of privileging of religious motive in other places too. For example, there is a different and much more lax set of regulations for religious schools, not just regulations around curriculum, but even around things like safety. There is also a far looser set of regulations governing financial disclosures, including disclosures around how state funding is being used by religious organizations. And if we take this together with tax exemptions, these seem to amount to the government giving religious citizens some extra privileges that atheists and agnostics don't get. And it raises the question of whether the American government is rewarding religiosity, even if it's not privileging any one specific religion. So how do we enact a form of religious freedom that truly extends equal rights both to religious and to non-religious Americans? There's one final challenge to religious freedom that I want to highlight, which is that the state has to define religion. And I originally phrased this as the government gets to, but I had to change it to has to because this is not an exciting task to be handed. It's pretty daunting. This is true in a very basic sense. The government decides what group counts as a religion for tax purposes and what might instead be classed as an extremist group or a cult. But this task also has to get granular. What practices are central to a religion's practice and therefore need to be prioritized for protection? Who counts as a religious actor? In the US, Protestantism has often been the guiding measure of what counts as a religion worthy of protection, although that has shifted slightly in recent years due to pushback from minority groups. Some would say the state casts the net too wide, giving groups religious protections who aren't really religious. And some would say it's far too narrow and conveniently excludes groups that the government would find it problematic to protect. But whichever way you lean, it is clearly a massive responsibility and one that has huge implications for the American religious landscape. So with those challenges front of mind here, I will wrap up this presentation, and I'd welcome any questions you have about religious freedom in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much. And I appreciate that wide-ranging overview. I know we had a couple of little problems with the technology, but we got from the 18th century to the present, and thank you very much. I want to begin by asking one question, and just to follow up on a theme you mentioned. You said something about American civil religion, and you also said Protestant Christianity has often had a privileged position in American history. Could you say a little more about the nature of what you called American civil religion and how it connects with Protestant Christianity? Is this still the core of the American civil religion?
That's a great question. So, civil religion, I think, is so important in part because it is one of, I think I use the word palpable, it's one of the most intimate ways that I think many of us experience religiosity today. We can choose to be religious, we can choose to participate in worship or in community, but this is one of the places where religiosity is often thrust upon us, is through civil religion. I think that for many Americans who, in particular, remember a time even just 4 or 5 decades ago, where Protestantism's dominance was less contested, I think that Protestantism is still very much at the heart of these memories of civil religion. And so, I'm thinking of that image of children reciting the Lord's Prayer in school. If you have that memory next to the memory of reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, which references God, next to the memory of lining up in gym class, I think all of those can get swirled together into a very amorphous but very powerful vision of what America represents. I do think that civil religion, in part because it's a place where there has been so much pushback, in particular from agnostics and atheists, on this constant referencing of God, it is one place where we see a lot of really concerted efforts on the part of the government to be pluralistic. So, for example, we have cases where a city council always opens their meeting with a prayer. And in response to complaints, they say, okay, instead of having the same Protestant preacher do it every week, we're going to cycle through all these various leaders in town. Mm-hmm. We're going to have a Unitarian, we're going to have a rabbi, we're going to have an imam. And I think that goes a long way towards making civil religion a much more inclusive and frankly much more accurate portrait of the American religious landscape. But the challenge that still remains is how to include folks who are not religious in this.
So related to that, a lot of what we might call religious nationalists in America say that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Do you think that is an accurate way to describe the relation between religion and the founding of America?
What an important question. No, I do not. But I think they have a lot of history that they can point to in defending that. And so in answer to that, I would draw our attention to the contrast between the First Amendment, the Constitution, how religion is discussed there, versus state constitutions. And I think what we see even in just the couple years following the founding is a real dissonance between the ideals of pluralism and equality that are laid out in the Constitution and the on-the-ground reality. And if we think about the examples that we have in colonial governance, that we're starting with theocracies in New England and trying to pull them into full egalitarian religious pluralism, that's a long journey to make, and it didn't happen overnight with the Constitution. But I think that especially if we look at the Constitution and the conversations taking place among the founders at a federal level, what we see is that even though they knew what a challenge this would be to institute, that their goal really was to move away from this model of Christian dominance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. This is still a hot issue even in our own time.
It really
about,
is.
What is the meaning of America and its relation to religion? I have a question here from Kathy Kuykendall, who asks, are there any potentially successful efforts by any group to remove tax-exempt status from religious groups? If not, why not? Is this just too radical for the USA? In other words, why do church groups and churches have tax-exempt status? And is anyone trying to change that?
So as I mentioned, there are a few groups who are kind of trying to do this in a global way to say all religions should get these tax-exempt statuses stripped. And Freedom From Religion Foundation is one of those groups. There are also efforts that have been made in a very targeted way at specific religious organizations. So saying, okay, we can give tax exemptions to the little neighborhood church that's running a homeless shelter, doing good for the community. But let's not give tax exemptions to mega churches that are raking in billions of dollars a year, that don't have to report how they spend that money, and they're still getting tax breaks and their house is paid for. Or folks who are saying, look at a group like Scientology that counts as a religion. That gets a tax break. So we've also seen very targeted efforts to just kick certain religious groups off of those roles. I think one potential answer as to why religious organizations get that tax-exempt status would be that there is an underlying assumption at play in American culture and American law that religion is generally a force for good. And that's, there are a few scholars who have spent their entire careers really just teasing out that notion alone. But I think one place we see it concretely manifesting is in these tax exemptions.
Okay, so you don't see any likely change in the tax-exempt laws in the near future?
The one thing I would say is this Equality Act, I think, really does pose a challenge to the many religious organizations. And as I said, we are not just talking about churches. We're talking about many nonprofits who have that tax-exempt status, and yet who are standing up and saying, we do not want to serve LGBTQ populations. And I think that's a place where, again, we might see the Supreme Court is not going to say you can't practice your religion, but they may say you can practice it, but you can't do that and accept the tax exemption.
Okay, thank you. Here comes a question from Max Orr, who's going to join our panel a little later, but he has a question about the changing nature of religious groups in American society. And although dominant groups have always defined what religious freedom means, it seems that it's a little dangerous to push too hard on your own view. So here's what he says: with a growing body of none, that is, people who say they have no religion, and especially a growing number of young people who say no religion, do you predict that this group, no religion, will eventually dominate in America?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I don't know that nuns will ever dominate, but another group that I would throw into the mix here as really radically shifting what religion looks like in this country is the spiritual but not religious folks. Because here we have a population of people who are not hostile to religion. Many of them do go to churches or to mosques, to synagogues, but instead of strongly identifying with that one religion, they identify more as an individual seeker who happens to have found a home in this one community. And so I think that, combined with the rise of the nuns, will dramatically shift the power that, in particular, religious denominations and religious organizations have when there's this intense loyalty between congregants and an actual institution of faith.
So Max also asks if the aggressive advocacy of religious views is alienating people and therefore leading, in fact, to a resistance to religion.
I mean, I think we can certainly see some of that at play. You don't get much of this in a lot of news sources, but there are very, very active religious groups who are trying to counter a lot of the rhetoric of the religious right, who are literally, at protests on the opposite side of the street. And so I think there is another really strong strand of religiosity in this country that's associated with the political left, that does more, welcome folks who would identify as spiritual but not religious, that is itself invested in questioning the mechanisms of power by which their own institutions, have grown and have flourished over the years. And I'm really interested to see what happens with that kind of growing movement on the religious left.
Okay, well, religion is dynamic and its history is always changing and what it means. We have a question from Paul Connick who wants to ask about the peyote case that you described. Does the peyote case define the limit of the free exercise of religion by corporate or other collectives as set out in the Hobby Lobby case? If not, what are the limiting standards? Are there any limits to what the Religious Freedom Act or amendments to the Constitution can restrict?
So if I understand the question correctly, the peyote case drew a hard line around what the First Amendment actually protected. And it said, basically, you can petition your state government, have them write a specific exemption, but we're not going to tell you that you can just opt out of this law. Something that comes to mind for me is a quote from Thomas Jefferson that he wrote during these debates around religious freedom, when he said, if someone else's religion causes me no harm, then why should we forbid it? The government's power only extends to those cases where people are causing one another harm. And I think the logic in Employment Division v. Smith was really that this law, which allows employers to fire employees for drug use, is designed for the good of the public. It's a reasonable thing for employees to not want their employees to be on drugs. And so they were really saying, you can have religious freedoms, but if it butts up against another law that defends public safety, the First Amendment is not going to protect you there. The RFRA blew that wide open. It blew it absolutely wide open. And so this is where we see that some folks are not satisfied with the protections that the First Amendment provides. And so this is where the legislature steps in and really tries to tangibly expand those freedoms.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a comment, perhaps more than a question, from Abby, who says, I'd like to remind everyone that just because an individual checks no religious affiliation doesn't mean that the individual isn't religious. Many are probably libertarian and think it's not anyone's business to know what their religion is. So I suppose the question is, could the growing number of no religion, as it were, in fact suggest a resistance of people to even share what their religious views might be? So they're still religious, they just don't tell you.
That's a very good question. Whether or not it winds up being statistically relevant, I think it's a really important phenomenon for us to attend to. This kind of fierce individualism that would lead people to say it's none of the government's business.
Yeah.
And I would guess that applies as well to many folks who would identify as spiritual, who would mark none, but who you're absolutely right, might still attend church or might even consider themselves quite religious, but not want to share that.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
They may never attend a church, but consider themselves very spiritual or religious.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this is a question from Jane that says simply, can you comment on the dominance of Catholics on the Supreme Court? This is quite a change from, you stressed the Protestant influence. Is it significant now that there are so many Catholics on the Supreme Court?
It is absolutely significant. What a great question. it's really only since the election of JFK, if we use that as a really crude marker, that that Catholics have been kind of welcomed into the Christian majority in this country. And I think today, especially, we're seeing a broader coalition on the religious right that includes Catholics as well as Mormons. And I want to be careful here of painting with a broad brush. I don't mean to imply at all that all Catholics, all Protestants, or all Mormons are part of the religious right. They're certainly spread out across both sides of the aisle. But this is one interesting kind of alliance that we're seeing, that groups that previously had been shunned by a Protestant majority are now being welcomed as partners in this mission to hold on to America's Christian legacy and Christian culture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a question from Jonathan Gerard, who is thinking about the polarization in our religious culture. And he wonders, do you see a coming realignment of religious groups in which the right wing of the several major religions would affiliate with each other around family value issues, and the left wing of various major religions affiliate around issues of social justice? So that, I guess to pose it differently, the traditional dichotomies of Protestant and Catholic or Christian and Jewish might actually be more clearly defined by their view on issues such as family values and social justice.
That's a wonderful point. I think yes, absolutely. I think we are moving in that direction. I think political partisanship has become such a larger wedge than has, the name of your religion. One really interesting question to ask here, in spite of the waves of Islamophobia that we've seen in the past several decades, is it possible that conservative Muslims will be welcomed into the religious right as fellow defenders of family values? That seems like a big possibility. And one historical example that I'd point us to here is in the few decades leading up to the Civil War, we saw schisms in a number of American Christian denominations over this issue of slavery, where, as you're describing now, it was less important whether or not you were Methodist than whether or not you supported slavery. And certainly we seem to be in a place where things are continuing to heat up instead of cool down.
That's an excellent point. The polarization over slavery tore religions apart and made that the relevant defining issue for people. And who knows, we may have a comparable situation now over certain political and social issues. This is a question from another participant named Harris. Why do you think religious issues have become so political and created such a great division between the two parties? Do you think the U.S. government will evolve because of this, perhaps with the introduction or growth of another political party? In other words, is the political division now also increasingly a religious division? I guess this kind of plays on the same issue that we were discussing before.
Yeah. This question of whether a third party could interrupt this is a really interesting one. As I mentioned several times, we associate the issue of religious freedom so strongly with the Republican Party. And religiosity in general with the Republican Party. And that's, that doesn't actually reflect the numbers. There are a lot of very religious folks in the Democratic Party and a lot of non-religious people in the Republican Party. One place where we can see this hyper-politicization is just in how President Trump and President Biden have been portrayed. So we have President Trump, who himself is not a religious man, and yet who was held up as an absolute champion of religious freedom, of religious values, and of America's religious traditions. And then with Biden, we actually have one of the most religious presidents that we've had in recent memory. He is a lifelong Catholic. He's very devoted. But the version of religious freedom that he is expected to promote from the Oval Office is one that does not line up with the kind of bullhorn version of religious freedom that we've been hearing at protests from the religious right for the last 4 years. So I mean, if a third party were to enter in and break up that dynamic where one party seems to own the issue of religious freedom, certainly I think that would be to the benefit of the country.
It is interesting. In Europe, there have often been parties called things like Christian Democratic Party. And we haven't had that specific label in the United States, but that would be an interesting evolution of American politics. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. We're going to take a 15-minute break and then come back and continue the discussion afterwards. Beginning at 11 o'clock, a panel with Ariane and Max are going to join us. So I want to invite all of our participants to take a short break, and we'll resume at 11. And meanwhile, I want to thank Joanna for a great account of religious freedom and religious issues in American society. Thank you so much, and we're going to continue this discussion in just a few minutes.
Thank you.
So hang in there with us. We're all going to take a little break, and we'll see you soon.